Hello, young soul. Welcome to the Daily Horror Channel. If you are afraid of real and scary reports, this channel is not for you. I suggest you leave this video, but if you are not afraid of listening to these horrifying reports, I suggest you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. In the heart of a decaying industrial town, there was a doll factory that, in times past, was famous for its artisanal creations. However, after a series of dark events, the factory was abruptly closed and abandoned. Helena, a freelance photographer searching for forgotten places, decided to explore the factory for an artistic project. What she didn't know was that this search for inspiration would turn into a nightmare of unimaginable terror. When I arrived at the entrance to the old Bellatrix doll factory, the sky was cloudy, and a cold wind was blowing through the deserted streets. The rusty iron gate was ajar, as if it had been waiting for my arrival. The building, an imposing structure of red brick and broken windows, exuded an aura of abandonment and mystery. My name is Helena, and I'm a photographer who specializes in capturing the beauty of abandoned places. The fascination with these places began when I was a child, and my grandmother told me stories about forgotten places where time seemed to have stopped. The Bellatrix doll factory was one of those places. I'd always heard rumors about the factory, how it was suddenly closed after a series of unexplained events and mysterious disappearances. I pushed the gate, and it creaked, echoing through the empty courtyard. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of crows and the rustling of leaves. As I approached the main entrance, a feeling of oppression began to weigh on me, but my curiosity and determination were stronger. I walked into the factory, and the first thing I noticed was the smell of mold and decay. The dim light coming in through the broken windows created dancing shadows on the walls, bringing imaginary figures to life. I started taking photos, capturing every detail of the place. The reception room was full of old furniture covered in dust, papers scattered across the floor, and in the center a large wooden counter. As I explored the room, I heard a soft noise, like the sound of something dragging across the floor. I stopped and held my breath, trying to locate the source of the sound. Anything. Silence reigned again, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I continued my exploration, heading down a narrow hallway that led to a large production room. The production room was huge, with stopped assembly lines and old machines covered in dust. The environment seemed frozen in time. Unfinished dolls were scattered everywhere, some hanging from hooks, others lying on the floor. The scene was both fascinating and disturbing. As I took photos, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air around me seemed to grow colder, and a feeling of oppression grew. Suddenly I heard a soft, barely audible whisper that seemed to come from all directions. I looked around, but there was no one. The whispering continued, now accompanied by a light melody, as if someone was playing a violin. I remembered the stories my grandmother told about the factory. The previous owner, a man named Arthur Bellatrix, was said to be a talented musician who used his music to inspire his creations. However, after his daughter's tragic death, he became obsessed with creating the perfect doll, believing he could bring his daughter's soul back. This obsession led to the factory's ruin and abrupt closure. My curiosity about the violin increased, and I began to follow the melody, which seemed to guide me through the dark corridors of the factory. Every step I took, the melody became clearer, but also more sinister. I passed rooms full of dolls, some with expressions so realistic they seemed alive. The shadows on the walls moved strangely, as if they were following my movements. I arrived at a smaller room where the violin melody was stronger. In the center of the room there was a wooden pedestal, and on it, an old, dusty violin. The sight of the violin made my heart race. The instrument emanated a sinister aura, and the feeling of oppression became almost unbearable. I approached the violin and, without thinking, reached out to play it. The moment my fingers touched the instrument, A wave of intense cold ran through my body. The melody stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I quickly turned around, but there was no one. The room was empty except for the shadows that seemed to move on their own. My mind was in turmoil, and the feeling of being watched increased with each passing moment. I decided to leave the room and look for more clues about what was happening at the factory. As I walked through the hallways, I started to notice that some objects had moved around. Dolls that were previously in one position were now in another, and some seemed to be looking at me with blank eyes. I arrived at an office that appeared to belong to the owner. The room was filled with old papers, account books, and photos of the factory in its glory days. In one of the drawers, I found a diary that belonged to Arthur Bellatrix. The pages were filled with notes about ancient experiments and rituals. One of the entries caught my attention. Today I tried the ritual again. Music is the key, but something is still missing. My daughter's soul is trapped between this world and the next. I need to find the perfect doll to channel her essence. I can't fail. My mind was racing, trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together. The unfinished dolls, the violin melody, the whispers. Everything was connected. Arthur Bellatrix had become involved in something much darker than anyone could imagine. I decided to go back to the violin room to investigate further. When I got there, I felt a cold air, and the melody started again, this time louder and more intense. The shadows around the pedestal stirred, forming a spectral figure. It was Arthur's daughter, with an expression of sadness and despair. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice echoing through the room. "My father tried to bring me back, but he failed. Now I'm trapped and the factory is cursed." My heart was beating fast and the feeling of fear was almost paralyzing. "What can I do to help you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Destroy the violin," she replied. "It's the source of the curse. Only then can my soul rest." I picked up the violin, feeling the intense cold in my hands. I looked at the spectral figure, who watched me with sad eyes. I knew I needed to do this, but the fear was overwhelming. With all my strength, I smashed the violin against the floor. The sound of cracking wood echoed through the room, and the spectral figure let out a high-pitched scream before disappearing. The melody stopped, and the air in the room became warm again. I felt a sense of relief, but also sadness. He knew he had freed the soul of Arthur's daughter, but the factory still held many secrets and dangers. I grabbed my gear and decided to get out of there as quickly as possible. As I left the factory, the sun began to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the courtyard. The feeling of being watched hadn't completely disappeared, and I knew my journey was far from over. The Bellatrix doll factory had been just the beginning. As I walked back to the city, night was falling quickly, enveloped by a blanket of darkness that seemed to have a life of its own. The sense of relief I felt after destroying the violin was quickly replaced by a new kind of uneasiness. The forest around the factory was shrouded in dense fog, and every shadow seemed to hide a dark secret. My legs were tired, but I kept walking, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, I heard a crack to my left. I stopped and looked around, but I didn't see anything. Silence returned, but my heart was still beating fast. I quickened my pace, trying to leave the factory as quickly as possible. As I walked through the forest, I began to feel like I wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched increased, and I began to hear soft, almost inaudible whispers around me. They seemed to come from all directions, surrounding me like an invisible circle. I stopped again, trying to locate the source of the whispers, but the fog and darkness made it difficult to see. Finally, I saw the city lights in the distance. The relief I felt upon seeing them was indescribable. I quickened my pace, determined to leave that damned place behind. When I reached the edge of the forest, I looked back one last time. The shadows seemed to move strangely, as if they were alive. I shook my head, trying to shake off the thoughts of terror, and continued walking until I reached the city. Upon entering the house, I locked the door and threw myself on the sofa, exhausted. My body hurt, and my mind was racing. I took out my diary and started writing down everything that had happened. The experience at the Bellatrix doll factory had been terrifying, but I knew I couldn't stop. I needed to find out more about the curse and what had happened to Arthur Bellatrix and his daughter. The following days were filled with research and trying to understand the events at the factory. I discovered that Arthur Bellatrix had been a man obsessed with getting his daughter back, using increasingly dark methods. Her search for the perfect doll led to a series of macabre experiments, and the factory was closed after a series of unexplained disappearances. While researching, I started to notice strange things happening in my house. Objects moved around on their own. I heard inexplicable noises at night, and the feeling of being watched never left me. One night, I woke up to the feeling of intense cold and realized that my room was full of dancing shadows. I got up and went to the living room. When I got there, I saw something that made me freeze in fear. In the center of the room, there was a doll, identical to the ones I had seen in the factory. His empty eyes seemed to watch me, and a sinister smile was carved on his face. I picked up the doll with shaking hands and realized there was something written on its base. The words, "The curse never ends," were engraved there. My heart was beating fast, and the feeling of terror was overwhelming. I knew I needed to return to the factory to discover the truth behind the curse, and possibly find a way to end it once and for all. I returned to the factory the next morning, determined to find answers. Upon entering, the feeling of oppression returned with full force. I began exploring again, this time looking for clues that could help me understand the curse. I found more notes from Arthur Bellatrix, detailing his experiments and his search for the perfect doll. I discovered that there was a secret basement in the factory where the darkest experiments were carried out. I found the entrance hidden behind a bookshelf in Arthur's office. The air in the basement was heavy and smelled of decay. The walls were covered in strange symbols and scratch marks, and the floor was littered with unfinished dolls and experiment materials. In the center of the basement, there was a large wooden table with an old book and a violin. The book was full of rituals and incantations, and the violin seemed to emanate a dark energy. I realized I needed to destroy both of them to end the curse once and for all. I picked up the book and the violin, feeling the weight of responsibility in my hands. As I prepared to destroy them, I heard slow, shuffling footsteps behind me. I turned and saw the spectral figure of Arthur's daughter, with an expression of sadness and despair. "Please help me," she whispered. "I'm stuck here because of my father's obsession. You must end this." With renewed determination, I broke the violin and tore up the book, throwing the pieces on the floor. The spectral figure let out a piercing scream before disappearing, and a wave of energy coursed through the basement, dispelling the shadows and the feeling of oppression. I left the factory feeling a mix of relief and sadness. He knew he had freed the soul of Arthur's daughter, but the factory still held many secrets and dangers. My journey was far from over, and the fight against the forces of darkness would be endless. As I walked back to town, the feeling that something more terrible was yet to come never quite left me. The dark forest held many secrets, and I was determined to uncover them, knowing that each discovery would bring new challenges and horrors to be faced. In the small town of Santa Clara, a place once full of life, now only echoes of a dark past remain. Among the city's faded memories, an imposing and frightening building stands out. The São Marcos Psychiatric Hospital. Abruptly closed decades ago after a series of mysterious deaths and rumors of macabre experiments, the hospital has been left to rot, its empty windows staring out at the city like dead eyes. Clara, a young medical student, has always been fascinated by this place, especially because her grandfather worked there as a psychiatrist. Determined to uncover the truth about what really happened, she prepares for a night of exploration that will change her life forever. When When I arrived at the entrance to the São Marcos Psychiatric Hospital, dusk was falling, casting long, menacing shadows over the building. The wind blew gently, carrying with it the smell of mustiness and decay. My flashlight was the only source of light as I pushed open the rusty iron gate, which creaked loudly, as if protesting my presence. My heart was beating fast, but my determination to uncover the secrets that haunted the hospital was stronger than my fear. I entered the hospital, and the air immediately became colder. The sound of the wind seemed amplified through the empty hallways, creating an ominous melody that echoed around me. My name is Clara, and since I was a child, I have always been fascinated by the stories my grandfather told about this place. He worked here as a psychiatrist, and before his death, he confided in me that terrible things had happened within these walls. Stories of patients who disappeared without a trace and of psychiatric experiments that went beyond the limits of ethics. As I walked through the halls, the flashlight illuminated scenes from a time gone by. Rusty wheelchairs, dust-covered stretchers, and papers scattered across the floor. The walls were covered in graffiti and signs of vandalism, but it was still possible to see traces of the old hospital. In one of the rooms, I saw an electroshock chair, a grim reminder of the methods used to attempt to cure the human mind. The silence was interrupted by a soft, distant sound, like the scratching of nails on a chalkboard. My heart quickened, and I followed the sound cautiously. I passed a recreation room where old toys were scattered across the floor. The sound got louder, and I realized it was coming from the second floor. I climbed the stairs carefully, trying not to make any noise. When I reached the second floor hallway, the feeling of oppression increased. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the air was thick. I saw a door ajar, and hesitantly, I pushed it open. The room was an old infirmary, with beds lined up along the walls. In the background, a metal cabinet was partially open, and something inside seemed to be moving. I approached the closet, feeling a chill run down my spine. I opened the door with a quick movement, and nothing. Just a draft that made the door slam against the wall. The sound I heard earlier now seemed to be everywhere, an indistinct whisper that made the skin crawl. I decided to continue my exploration, determined to discover more. I passed through more hallways and rooms, each one scarier than the last. In one of the rooms, I found an old doctor's office. The table was covered in papers, and on the wall there was a blackboard with notes that looked like formulas or rituals. In the corner of the room, a bookshelf caught my attention. Among the dusty books, I found a diary with the name Dr. Julio Marquez engraved on the cover. It was my grandfather's diary. I sat down in the office chair and started reading my grandfather's notes. He described patients with serious disorders, but also mentioned practices that went beyond conventional psychiatry. There were reports of deep hypnosis sessions, sensory deprivation, and something he called spiritual reconnection treatment. The descriptions were disturbing, and some pages were stained with what appeared to be blood. As I read, I heard the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. I quickly closed the diary and left the office, looking both ways. There was no one there, but the feeling of being watched was intense. I continued walking, following the footsteps that now seemed further away. The corridors seemed endless, each one leading to more rooms full of secrets and horrors. I arrived at an isolated wing of the hospital, where the doors were locked with chains. I managed to pry open one of the doors, and it opened with a loud creak. The room was small and dark, with just a bed and a table. On the table, there was a dusty violin. I picked up the violin carefully, feeling a strange energy emanating from it. Suddenly, I heard a soft and sad melody, as if someone was playing the violin. The melody seemed to come from inside my head, and a feeling of despair came over me. I put the violin back on the table and left the room, trying to put the music out of my mind. As I walked through the halls, the melody continued, growing louder and more distressing. The shadows on the wall seemed to move, and the whispers returned, louder and clearer. "Help us," said the whispers, over and over again. "Release us." My mind was in turmoil, and the feeling of terror was overwhelming. I kept walking, trying to find a way out, but the hallways felt like a maze. The shadows on the walls became distinct figures, moving and watching me. The cold was increasing and my body was shaking. I arrived at a large room that appeared to be a special treatment room. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and in the center of the room was an operating table. Surgical instruments were scattered everywhere, and the floor was stained with dried blood. On the opposite wall, I saw a large mirror, and as I approached it, I saw a figure behind me. I turned quickly and saw the spectral figure of a woman. She had an expression of sadness and pain, and her eyes were fixed on me. "You need to end this," she whispered. "My spirit is trapped here because of the experiments. Find Dr. Marcus's complete diary and destroy it. Only then will I be able to rest." My mind was in turmoil, but I knew I needed to follow his instructions. I went back to my grandfather's office and looked for more clues. At the back of the bookshelf, I found a secret compartment with more pages from the diary. The notes detailed dark rituals and experiments on patients that went beyond comprehension. With the pages in hand, I returned to the special treatments room. The spectral figure was still there, waiting. I placed the pages on the floor and used one of the surgical instruments to cut them out and burn them. The pages began to disintegrate, and the spectral figure let out a piercing scream before disappearing. The shadows on the walls dissipated, and the violin melody stopped. The feeling of oppression lessened and the air became lighter. He knew he had freed at least one spirit, but the hospital still held many secrets and horrors. I grabbed my gear and left the hospital, determined never to return. As I walked back to town, the full moon lit my path, casting eerie, unsettling shadows along the road. Although I had managed to free at least one spirit trapped in the São Marcos psychiatric hospital, I knew that many other souls were still at the mercy of the dark forces there. The battle was far from over, and the relief I felt was quickly replaced by new determination. I got home and immediately locked all the doors and windows. The silence of the night felt heavier than ever, as if the air itself was waiting for something. I decided to review my grandfather's notes again, trying to find some clue that could help me better understand the curse that haunted the hospital. I spent hours reading the remaining pages of the diary, discovering disturbing details about the experiments carried out at the hospital. My grandfather described how he and other doctors tried to cure patients by subjecting them to sensory deprivation treatments, deep hypnosis, and even spiritual reconnection rituals. Many of these experiments resulted in horrific deaths or the unexplained disappearance of patients. As I read, something caught my attention. A mention of a secret room in the hospital's basement where the darkest experiments were carried out. I decided I needed to go back there and find out what was in the secret room. But this time, I wouldn't go alone. I invited my friend Lucas, who has always been skeptical about the supernatural, to accompany me. I told him everything I had discovered, and, although he was reluctant, he agreed to help me. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and some tools, we returned to the São Marcos Psychiatric Hospital the following night. Upon arrival, the feeling of oppression and fear immediately returned. We entered the hospital, and the cold, thick air enveloped us. We followed the empty corridors, now even more frightening with the presence of Lucas, whose cynical comments failed to dispel the growing tension. We went underground, where the darkness seemed even more intense. We looked for the entrance to the secret room and finally found it hidden behind a false wall. Upon opening the door, a smell of mold and decay hit us, and we entered cautiously. The secret room was even more disturbing than I imagined. The walls were covered in strange ancient symbols, and in the center of the room was a large stone circle marked with dried blood. Surgical instruments and other macabre objects were scattered everywhere, and the air was filled with a sense of pure evil. Lucas, trying to maintain his composure, began filming the room with his camera, while I examined the symbols on the walls. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped drastically, and we heard whispers around us. The lights of the flashlights began to flicker, and a dense shadow began to form in the center of the pedestrian circle. The shadow took shape, revealing the spectral figure of a woman, the same one I had seen before. Her gaze was fixed on me, and her eyes shone with a mixture of pain and anger. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice echoing through the room. "The curse is stronger than you imagine. You cannot free us." Before we could react, the figure began to move towards us, and the feeling of oppression increased. The shadows on the walls moved, and the whispers became harrowing screams. Lucas, in a panic, tried to run out, but the room door closed with a bang, locking us inside. "Clara, what's going on?" Lucas shouted, his voice full of fear. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here," I replied, trying to remain calm. "We need to find a way to free these souls." I remembered my grandfather's notes about the spiritual reconnection ritual. We needed to complete the ritual to break the curse. I frantically searched for the diary and found the instructions for the ritual. Lucas and I began following the steps, drawing symbols on the floor and reciting the ancient words. As the ritual progressed, the spectral figure writhed and screamed, and the shadows around us became more aggressive. Finally, with the last word of the ritual, an intense light filled the room and the spectral figure let out a final scream before disappearing. Silence returned, and the feeling of oppression disappeared. The door to the room opened on its own, and Lucas and I walked out quickly, breathing heavily. We returned to the surface, relieved to be out of that hell. As we walked back to town, I looked at the hospital one last time. I knew there were still many secrets and horrors hidden there, but at least part of the curse had been broken. As we walked back to the city, a lingering feeling of restlessness accompanied us. The cold air and darkness of the night seemed to take on greater weight, as if we were being watched. The relief that we had escaped the psychiatric hospital was overshadowed by the certainty that something was still not right. We arrived at my house, and Lucas decided to spend the night there to make sure I was safe. We locked all the doors and windows, trying to create a barrier between ourselves and the horrors we had faced. We sat in the living room in silence, still trying to process everything that had happened. Suddenly, the light started to blink. I exchanged an apprehensive look with Lucas, and my heart accelerated. The terror of the hospital seemed to be following us. A low, scratching sound, like nails scraping on wood, came from the front door. I slowly got up and walked to the door, my whole body shaking with fear. "Clara, don't open it," Lucas whispered, his voice shaking. Ignoring the warning, I looked through the peephole. Outside in the darkness, I saw nothing. I took a deep breath and opened the door just a crack, trying to get a better look. The scratching suddenly stopped, and an oppressive silence took over the house. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice sounding weak and nervous. With no response, I closed the door and turned to Lucas. Before I could say anything, all the lights went out, plunging us into total darkness. The feeling of being watched came back with a vengeance, and I began to hear indistinct whispers around me. "We need to get out of here," Lucas said, his voice full of panic. I grabbed a flashlight and turned it on, illuminating the room. Shadows seemed to move at the edges of the light, dancing and distorting in sinister ways. Suddenly, an intense cold filled the air, and a figure appeared in the center of the room. It was the same spectral figure as the woman we saw in the hospital, but now it seemed stronger and more defined. "Did you think you could escape?" the figure whispered, his voice echoing unnaturally. "The curse never ends. You're stuck with it now." Lucas and I stepped back, trying to get away from the figure, but it moved forward, extending a translucent hand toward us. The temperature of the room dropped even further, and my body began to shake uncontrollably. The shadows on the walls writhed, forming horrified faces and mouths open in silent screams. "We need to do something," I muttered, my mind racing to find a solution. Lucas picked up one of the remaining pages of my grandfather's diary and began reciting a passage that appeared to be a banishing incantation. The spectral figure let out a shrill scream, and the shadows began to stir even more. But instead of disappearing, the figure seemed to grow stronger from the enchantment. "No, this is making her stronger," I screamed. Desperate, we looked for another solution. I took a candle and lit it, hoping the light would drive away the darkness. The candle flame flickered violently but remained lit. The spectral figure stopped for a moment, and the shadows retreated slightly. "Keep the light going," Lucas said, his voice strained. I walked towards the figure with the candle, trying to push it back. The candlelight seemed to create a temporary barrier, but it wasn't enough to completely dispel the evil presence. The figure twitched and let out an agonized scream before disappearing completely, leaving an oppressive silence in its place. But we knew we weren't finished. The feeling of oppression and fear persisted, as if the curse was still present. The house was completely silent, except for the sound of our heavy breathing. We decided the only way to end this was to destroy all remaining connections to the hospital. We burned the remaining pages of my grandfather's diary and any other objects that could be linked to the curse. The flames quickly devoured everything, and for a brief moment, I felt a sense of relief. But at the same time, I realized that something was still wrong. As the last flame died down, I heard a distant rising sound of music. It was the violin melody, the same one we heard in the hospital. The music seemed to come from inside my mind, becoming louder and more piercing. The shadows on the walls began to move again, and the feeling of intense cold returned. I looked at Lucas, and his face was pale with fear. "This can't be happening," he muttered. The spectral figure reappeared in the center of the room, now stronger and more defined than ever. "You can never get rid of me," she said, her voice full of hate and despair. "I am the curse, and you are destined to suffer for all eternity." The shadows around us closed in, and the feeling of oppression became unbearable. The violin music reached a deafening crescendo, and everything around us began to spin. The ground beneath our feet seemed to dissolve, and reality disintegrated into total darkness. At that moment, I knew that we were forever trapped in the curse of the São Marcos Psychiatric Hospital, destined to wander in darkness forever without hope of salvation. The fight against the forces of darkness never ends, and we have been defeated, trapped in an endless cycle of terror and despair. No one ever knew what really happened to Clara and Lucas. The São Marcos Psychiatric Hospital remained abandoned, a silent monument to terror and evil. The city of Santa Clara avoided talking about the hospital, and over time, it was forgotten, becoming just another dark legend in the city's history. But at night, those who dared approach swore they heard whispers and a distant violin melody, eternal reminders of a curse that can never be broken. There's something inherently unsettling about an abandoned amusement park. That place that was once filled with laughter and joy now became a desolate landscape of rust and oppressive silence. In the heart of the city of Montella, the old Parque Mirante do Sol had been abandoned for over 30 years, since the tragic accident that took the lives of several people and marked the city forever. The stories and urban legends about the park only increased over time, attracting the curious and brave who sought the thrill of the unknown. I decided it was time to face my fears and capture something truly unique for my next photography project. My name is Anna, and I have always been fascinated by the unknown, by places forgotten by time. Parque Mirante do Sol has always been on my list, but its dark reputation has kept me away until now. Armed with my camera and courage, I headed to Montella on a cold autumn night. As I reached the park's rusty gate, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The park's old lights, now turned off, seemed to watch my arrival. I forced the gate open, the sound of creaking metal echoing through the darkness. The park stretched out before me, a maze of decaying attractions and wild vegetation that grew out of control. I began exploring, taking photos and capturing the unsettling silence that seemed to swallow everything around me. I passed the Ferris wheel, its gondolas swaying in the wind, and the carousel, whose wooden horses had expressions frozen in a lost time. The atmosphere was oppressive. The air felt colder and heavier with every step I took. I began to hear inexplicable noises. The distant sound of children's laughter, the creaking of rotting wood, whispers that seemed to come from everywhere. My rational mind tried to explain everything as the result of an imaginative mind and the frightening environment, but a part of me knew something else was going on. As I passed an ancient hall of mirrors, I noticed a shadow moving in the corner of my eye. I stopped and looked around, my heart racing. There was no one there, just my distorted reflection in the broken mirrors. I continued walking, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. I arrived at the center of the park, where the main bandstand once stood. Now it was just a rotting wooden structure covered in vines. I decided to set up my tripod there and take some night photos. As I was adjusting the camera, I heard a sound that made me freeze. It was the soft sound of a violin, playing a sad and melancholy melody. I turned around quickly, but I didn't see anyone. The music seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. "Who's there?" My voice sounded weak and shaky in the darkness. No response, just the music that continued to play. I decided to follow the sound, trying to find its origin. With each step, the melody grew louder, more piercing. I arrived at a small, open-air theater where the wooden chairs were broken and covered in moss. On the stage, a slender, translucent figure played a violin. His movements were graceful, but there was something deeply unsettling about his presence. You are." My voice broke. The figure stopped playing and looked directly at me. His eyes were pits of darkness, and a feeling of utter despair washed over me. I tried to take a step back, but my legs wouldn't respond. The figure began to walk towards me, and the violin melody turned into a sharp, dissonant sound, piercing my ears like needles. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, trying to back away. "Freedom." The figure's voice was a whisper, mixed with the wind. Regaining control of my legs, I ran in the opposite direction, trying to find a way out. The shadows around me seemed to move, forming indistinct figures that chased me. I arrived at the entrance gate, but it was locked. I looked back and saw the figure of the violin standing in the distance, its presence becoming more and more oppressive. "Please let me go," begged. The figure just raised the violin again and began to play, the melody now sounding like a funeral dirge. The gate opened on its own, and I ran out of the park, feeling the weight of the curse still on me. As I walked back to my house, the violin music continued to echo in my mind, and the shadows seemed to follow me wherever I went. I knew that the curse of Parque Mirante do Sol had not ended, and that I was linked to it in some way. The photographs I took revealed more than just the abandoned park. They showed dark, distorted figures, forever captured on film. The days that followed my visit to Parque Mirante do Sol were a continuous torment. The violin melody continued to echo in my mind, and the feeling of being watched never disappeared. My nights were haunted by vivid nightmares, in which I was back in the park, haunted by indistinct shadows and the ghostly figure of the violinist. More and more, I felt like the only way to find peace was to return to the park and discover the truth behind the curse. I talked to my friend Lucas, who was as skeptical as he was brave. He has always been my confidant and partner in my photographic adventures. When I told him about what had happened in the park, he initially thought I was exaggerating, but when he saw the photos I took, his expression changed. "That's it. Scary, Anna. We need to go back there," Lucas said, finally understanding the gravity of the situation. We decided that we would return to the park together, this time more prepared. We brought more powerful flashlights, audio and video recording equipment, and some basic defense tools. It was a cold, foggy night when we returned to Parque Mirante do Sol. The air felt heavier than before, and the silence was almost deafening. We entered through the rusty gate, which this time opened easily, as if it had been waiting for us. The park was exactly as I remembered, but the feeling of oppression was even stronger. We started exploring again, this time with Lucas recording everything with his camera. "Anna, are you sure you want to do this?" Lucas asked, his voice betraying a slight tremor. "We have no choice, Lucas. We need to find out what's going on here," I replied, trying to hide my own fear. We arrived at the center of the park where the main bandstand was covered in vegetation. The violin melody began to play again, this time louder and clearer. I followed the sound, my heart beating fast. Lucas followed me closely, his camera recording every step. "There." Lucas pointed to the small open-air theater, where the slender figure was once again playing the violin. This time the figure seemed more solid, more real. His clothes were old-fashioned and his face was partially covered by a shadow. We approached cautiously, and the figure stopped playing, looking directly at us. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice firm despite my fear. The figure didn't respond but began walking towards us. I felt an intense cold, and the shadows around us began to move again. Lucas and I backed away, but the figure followed us, the violin melody resonating hauntingly. "We need to do something, Anna," Lucas shouted, trying to keep the camera steady. I remembered my grandfather's old notes on banishing rituals. He had mentioned that certain spirits could be attached to specific objects. The violin. Maybe it was the instrument that kept the spirit trapped here. I decided we needed to destroy the violin. "Lucas, the violin. We need to destroy it," I shouted, running towards the figure. Lucas followed me, and together we advanced on the spirit. The figure raised the violin as if he knew what we were going to do, and the melody became a high-pitched, deafening scream. The shadows around us closed in, forming a barrier of darkness. "Keep going, Anna," Lucas encouraged while fighting the shadows. I took the violin from the spectral figure's hands and, with all my strength, threw it against the ground, breaking it into pieces. A horrible scream echoed through the park, and the figure dissolved into a cloud of shadows. The shadows around us dissipated, and silence reigned again. Breathing hard, I looked at Lucas. His expression was one of pure relief, but also of a new understanding of the world that he had never accepted before. We sat on the floor, trying to catch our breath and our sanity. "Do you think this is over?" Lucas asked, looking at the remains of the violin. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here," I replied, still shaking. As we walked away from the theater, a strange calm took over the park. The oppression and cold disappeared, but I knew the peace was only temporary. The history of Parque Mirante do Sol was far from being resolved. As we drove home that night, the uneasy feeling never left me. We knew we had accomplished something significant by breaking the violin, but we also understood that the real battle was yet to come. We spent the following days reviewing the recordings and photographs, trying to find some clue that could help us better understand the curse of Parque Mirante do Sol. One night, I received an unexpected phone call. It was Lucas, his voice sounding urgent and tense. "Anna, we need to talk. I discovered something important. Meet me at the city library," he said before hanging up abruptly. I went to the library, where Lucas was waiting for me with a stack of old books and documents. He looked exhausted, but determined. "What did you find?" I asked, sitting down next to him. "I was researching the history of the park and found old records that talk about a talented violinist who mysteriously disappeared during the construction of the park. He was obsessed with a melody he said he heard in his dreams. He believed that melody had the power to control the souls of the dead," explained Lucas, handing me one of the books. "So the spirit we saw is the violinist himself?" I asked, intrigued. "It seems so. But there is more. I discovered that the violin we destroyed was just one of the objects he used to channel the power of melody. There are other items scattered throughout the park, each connected to a part of the curse," Lucas said, pointing to a map of the park with several points marked. "We need to destroy all these items to end the curse once and for all," he concludes, feeling a new wave of determination. We prepared for one last foray into the park, this time determined to end the curse once and for all. We returned to Parque Mirante do Sol on a cold, cloudy night, the perfect setting for the final confrontation. Armed with flashlights, tools, and the knowledge we had acquired, We began our search for the remaining objects. Every step in the park felt heavier, as if an invisible force was trying to stop us. We found the first object, an old music box buried near the Ferris wheel. Lucas destroyed it with a hammer, and a deafening scream echoed through the park, followed by an oppressive silence. We continued our search, finding a series of objects, each more disturbing than the last. A porcelain doll with empty eyes, an antique clock that still ticked, a framed photograph of a group of smiling children. Each time we destroyed an object, the park's evil presence seemed to weaken, but it also reacted with more force, making our task increasingly difficult. We reached the last object, a yellowed sheet of music with the melody that the obsessed violinist had written. It was kept in a glass box inside the Hall of Mirrors. Upon destroying it, the spectral figure of the violinist appeared for the last time, more real and terrifying than ever. "You can't stop me," he shouted, his voice resonating with unearthly fury. Lucas and I prepare for the final confrontation. While he distracted the spirit, I ran towards the sheet music and tore it into pieces. A powerful wind rose, and the violinist's figure let out an agonizing scream before dissipating into a cloud of shadows. The park fell silent, the feeling of oppression finally disappearing. We knew we had done it. The curse had been broken, and the violinist's spirit was finally at peace. I looked at Lucas and he smiled, relieved. "We did it, Anna. We finally did it," he said, hugging me. As we left Parque Mirante do Sol for the last time, a feeling of peace and accomplishment came over me. The battle had been tough, but we had won. The city of Montella could finally forget the horrors of the park, and I could move on, knowing I made a difference. But as I looked back one last time, I saw a shadow moving through the trees, a reminder that true terror never completely disappears. The fight between light and darkness is eternal, and although we have won that battle, the war against the unknown and the supernatural continues, and I was ready to face whatever challenges the future brought.